Okay, I didn't say the date last time. It's still 11 of October 2025. Anyway, so as a result of going through a little of the relativity of the God concept in Meister Eckhart, which is section B in chapter 5, the type problem in poetry in psychological types, we're hoping to get a little bit of clarity about how it can avoid pluralism, how it can avoid the trap of relativism, while at the same time preserving our sense of the importance of the individual. So Eckhart through Jung is going to help us with this. The reason that Jung is exploring this is because um, uh, Wagner, Goethe, and Nietzsche are all oriented to the early medieval period and to early medieval psychology. This is from page 241. And so Jung feels that there's something about that period which is maybe important and perhaps unresolved. Um, so there's something about particularly the legend of the Grail that Jung feels in terms of the Holy Grail is an expression of a symbol that resulted in a new orientation to life by the taking up of that symbol. And so Jung talks about how that symbol derives from pre-Christian origins. It has pagan and Gnostic roots. And so there's something that Jung feels that the mainstream part of the culture is missing. That, again, especially when we're talking about this, I'm not talking about something which is, in a sense, essentially opposed to at least aspects of Christianity. I mean, look at this for God's sake. But it's the thing is that I don't want to get stuck in a particular story. So, and I expressed that already. So, in Gnosticism, and again, I'd recommend episode 18 of Awakening from the Meaning Crisis, which is on it, on Gnosticism. The basic idea is that we can actually get direct knowledge, direct individual access to experience of the sacred or divine. And so for Jung, this has a Promethean quality. Jung says, Gnosticism contained the very thing that most strongly resisted the regular fide, that Promethean and creative spirit, which will bow only to the individual soul and to no collective ruling. Although in crude form, we find in Gnosticism what was lacking in the centuries that followed, a belief in the efficacy of individual revelation and individual knowledge. So how can we build a sense of what's important about that, but at the same time, not regress into anarchism? How can we preserve unity, coherence, togetherness, belonging? Yeah. And so this kind of belief, this Gnostic belief is based in our affinity with the gods. So our we could even say our oneness, this having a shared sense of essence with the divine that I think we can see as a direct result of mystical experience. At least certain types of mystical experience. I wouldn't want to say all necessarily. And so this is why this focus on German mysticism. This is why this focus on Meister Eckhart. So this is how we sort of get into the exploration of Eckhart as a particularly, um, as Jung calls the greatest thinker of that age, the early medieval period. We don't know much about his personal life. I'm going to do a little Google for the sake of clarity. Yeah, German theologian, German Catholic priest, theologian, philosopher, and mystic. Anything else to say? Not much in the Holy Roman Empire. Um, yeah, from the year 1260 to 1328. So the 12th century. I think that's 12th century. Okay. And yeah, so the important thing about Eckhart is his sense of inner affinity with God, which is in strong contrast to the Christian sense of sin, original sin. And so for Jung, this is a clear sort of taking us straight back toward the Upanishads, toward these Eastern analogies. It's this in affinity, inner again, the Tolstoy, the kingdom of God is within you, the oneness with God. And so Jung says Eckhart must have experienced a quite extraordinary enhancement of the value of the soul, of his own inner being, that enabled him to rise to a purely psychological and relativistic conception of God and of his relation to man. And so by relativity of the God, Jung says this denotes a point of view that does not conceive of God as absolute or wholly cut off from man and existing outside and beyond all human conditions, but as in a certain sense, dependent on him. And it implies a reciprocal and essential relation between man and God. So again, this is like in the relational ontology stuff of like, yes, we need the gods, but the gods need us. Where so in this relativity of God, we can understand that like man can be understood, human can be understood as a function of God, but God can be understood as a function of man. And so for Jung, the God image, yeah, like our imaginal or imagistic expression of God, is the symbolic expression of a particular psychic state. And that is characterized by its absolute ascendancy over the will of the subject. So it has an autonomy and a numinous force, which means that it can bring about or enforce actions and achievements that could never be done by conscious effort. So this is what Jung talks about in terms of the God function. So there's a kind of psychologization of God as a component of the psyche. And Jung is going to go into this in some detail. We're going to be exploring what it means to psychologize God in this way and hope to see how that's valuable while at the same time not being limited to it. So it's a perspective that goes along with this story. Yeah, so in the terminology of internal family systems, God could be seen as a kind of dominant part. It's a part where the sort of the transcendence that goes along with us is housed, the numinosity. Yeah, and we could see from there that, for example, qualities, defined qualities that I would argue limit our conception of God, such as like omnibenevolence, omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, all powerful, all knowing, all present, and all good, um, could be seen as a kind of compensation from what we feel, that derive from a sense of the lack of those things, those qualities. And so for Jung, this overpowering sort of impetus to action that we see from what he calls the God function, is a kind of inspiration that transcends conscious understanding. And for Jung, that has its source in an accumulation of energy in the unconscious, where the unconscious is essentially, in some ways, equivalent to God. For Jung, it's not. It's sort of like the storehouse of God. It's the place within us through which we access God. This is Jung's understanding of what we mean by the relativity of God in psychological terms, which we're exploring through the example of Eckhart. So for Jung, that means that God ends up being a function of the unconscious. And so, yeah, again, we're sort of exploring here limitations of what we commonly, let's say, commonly understand by God. And Jung is then going to talk about how we can, like, he's sort of doing something quite reductive at the moment. And we're hoping to get beyond that in a minute. Yeah. And so for Jung, the sense that sort of God is acting independently implies a kind of detachment from one's own unconscious, where psychologically speaking, there would be an unawareness of the fact that God's actions springs from one's own inner being. Whereas on the other hand, the relativity of God means that a not, quote, a not inconsiderable portion of the unconscious process is registered, at least indirectly, as a psychological content. So this is the idea that we feel, we experience that God can act through us, and in a sense, as a part of us, or with us as a vessel, you could say. But again, I would invoke this kind of sense of equality where, yes, we have different qualities than God or than the gods, but they need us just as much as we need them. What they lack is limitation in us. Yeah, and for Jung, that sense of the relativity of God, that God can act through one, that we can be aware of that, is only sort of possible the more our libido, our energy is withdrawn from the objects of the world. So the more that energy is drawn in the direction of realism in terms of what we were discussing last time, the more that energy is introverted, withdrawn from projection into objects. Yeah, so the more that those contents of the unconscious are withdrawn, the more they can be endowed with a conscious quality where they can appear as belonging to the subject. And that's what he claims happened with the mystics. This is what happens with mystics. They go through this withdrawal, which often characterized by asceticism, withdrawal of energy from the things of this world, and experience the an inner unity and inner oneness with what they worship. Briefly, Jung analogizes the what happens in mysticism and to mystics, namely we're talking about the relativity of God, to the to shamanic practice, to the concept of the role of a medicine man, where at that what Jung calls stage of cultural development, this kind of first demonstrable conception of an all-pervading spiritual force, by which he means there's a way that the sort of power of the shaman as a figure relies on their capacity to draw together energy into themselves, collecting mana or spiritual power, so as to deploy that at will. And so that's what allows Jung to say that the relativity of God in medieval mysticism is therefore a regression to what he calls primitive condition, where we can see, obviously, we don't have to agree with the idea that that's a regression. Um, I'm just going to move on a little. Yeah, he contrasts this with Eastern analogies, where, for example, um, the concept of the Atman in the Eastern teachings, not so much a regression, according to him, as a continuous development in a typically Eastern way, that according to him still manages to preserve the efficacy of the primitive principle. And so there's a way that he feels that um, there's a kind of uninterrupted connection with what is natural that kept humanity in touch with Mother Earth, who is for Jung the sort of the prime source of this power that we're speaking of. It's in the sense of being an inner condition that God flows through one from deeply within, from what is natural. Yeah, and so but when we see that from Jung says, when we see that from the heights of a differentiated point of view, whether rational or ethical, these instinctive forces are impure, but life itself flows from springs both clear and muddy. Hence, all excessive purity lacks vitality, where a constant striving for clarity and differentiation means a proportionate loss of vital intensity, precisely because the muddy elements are excluded. Every renewal of life needs the muddy as well as the clear. This is why Jung's real focus on integrating the shadow, because it's by like we clearly need to like re-establish our connection with the source without making a regression by which we're sort of overcome in the Nietzschean sense by Dionysus without being torn apart. So how again, how can we return to the source without regressing, without by preserving a sense of order, by preserving the gains made in consciousness since the Holocene, let's say. Jung thinks Eckhart could see this when Eckhart says, for this reason, God is willing to bear the brunt of sins and often winks at them, mostly sending them to those whom he has destined for great things. Behold, who was dearer and nearer to our Lord than the apostles? Not one of them but fell into mortal sin. All were mortal sinners. In the Old Testament and in the New, he has shown this to be true of those who afterwards were far the dearest to him. And still today, one seldom finds that people come to great things without they first go somewhat astray. We have a few more quotes that I will quote all of the passages from Eckhart. For man is truly God, and God is truly man. It's a total equivalence, much the same as not quite the same, but Atman Brahman, it's equivalent. Eckhart goes on, whereas he who has not God, whereas he who has not God as such an inner possession, but with every means must fetch him from without, in this thing or in that, where he is then sought for in vain in all manner of works, people or places. Verily, such a man has him not, and easily something comes to trouble him. And it is not only evil company that troubles him, but also the good, not only the street, but also the church. Not only vile words and deeds, but the good as well. For the hindrance lies within himself. Because in him God has not yet become the world. God has not yet become the world. Were God that to him, then all would be well and good with him in every place and with all people, always possessing God. This is going to end up being quite important later because essentially the via positiva that I've been speaking of, a cataphatic rather than apophatic way that avoids idolatry while at the same time um, unveiling a deeper sense of the sacred or of the divine. The whole point is um, to express by creativity and with personality, not by just withdrawing as we've been prescribed, but by more deeply participating. And I think the way that that will show up is that if we sort of can orient the logos toward the world, toward the natural forms that we see in a certain way, the world will come to be unveiled as God. Obviously, what Jung understands by this is that when God is outside, he's sort of necessarily outside one, sort of necessarily projected into objects. But um, Freud quoted to Jung that I always need an object to love. You always also see this in the Imitation of Christ. There's a way that that object always ends up exerting an overpowering influence over the subject, holding him in slavish dependence, to quote Jung. That's what Eckhart's referring to, this subjection to the object, which makes the world appear in the role of God as an absolutely determining factor. Yeah, so there's a way that they're still talking about a via negativa. They're still talking about going deeply within. And I'm saying yes, but once there is a revelation of some kind, the whole point for Jung, and we'll explore this later on, but the whole point for Jung of going deeply within is so that the unconscious has a chance to elicit these symbols, which are then supposed to be taken out into the world, extroverted into the world. And we don't want to forget that. So I think the orientation to whether we're taking energy within, withdrawing it into going up into one or going down into many depends which stage of the process that we're in. In that same passage, Eckhart says, "He that is right in his feeling is right in any place and in any company. But if he is wrong, he finds nothing right wherever or with whom he may be. For a man of right feeling has God within." Yeah, so there's a way that when we have this condition of inner unity with God, then we place a value upon ourselves that makes us everywhere at ease. And there's a way that of being independent of objects, not relying on them, not needing them, never needing and hoping to get from the object what he lacks himself, to quote Jung. And from all that, where Jung's hoping that it's clear that God is a psychological or particularly psychodynamic state of being. It's a state, actually a state of being that aligns perfectly with the Eastern analogies that we were discussing in those episodes of a source of dynamic, creative, upwelling, feeling toned positivity in a phrase. Eckhart quotes, "By this kingdom of God, we understand the soul, for the soul is of like nature with the Godhead. Hence, all that has been said here of the kingdom of God, how God is himself the kingdom, may be said with equal truth of the soul. St. John says, all things were made by him. This is to be understood of the soul, for the soul is all things. The soul is all things because she is an image of God, and as such, she is also the kingdom of God. So much, says one master, is God in the soul. So much, says one master, is God in the soul, that his whole divine nature depends upon her. It is a higher state for God to be in the soul than for the soul to be in God. The soul is not blissful because she is in God. She is blissful because God is in her. Rely upon it. God himself is blissful in the soul. So the soul being in all things sort of relates to this, again, three-layer conception of like heaven, human, and earthly, or spirit, soul, and body, where the soul is this mediating middle layer. And it's like, I think part of humans' responsibility not only to steward the world, let's say, but to ensoul the world. And there's a way that I feel that the individuation of the soul of the world sort of depends upon the um, mutualistic symbiosis or opponent processing reciprocal opening between the soul of nature and the soul of mankind, without forgetting the heavenly aspect of the soul. Anyway, so then Jung gets a little bit, this is the first time the soul has come up, and so Jung's wanting to get a little bit of color on what we mean by that. And he's saying that it's a sort of, it refers to a psychological content, like something within our psychology that has some autonomy. And without that autonomy, we would never have given it an independent existence. So it must be a content with some spontaneity and therefore some also partial unconsciousness. He refers to, again, primitives who have several souls. And I think there's a way that we're wanting to take this up in sequence, like by, again, adopting different identities, different perspectives, and then dropping them again. Hopefully, we can do that while also preserving the sense of unity, as in not depleting ego strength. That would be, if it was in a schizophrenic direction, then it would be toward in the nominalist direction, down among the many, the manyness of the different aspects of the soul, and not drawing them together into the strength of the ego personality, which is still quite important. The language of IFS would act as a bridge there, internal family systems. Yeah, and so I think we can see from that that the soul is highly constrained when not multi-faced. We need to allow for the multifaceted nature of the soul. And it's we, the ego, who are the unity of ourselves. We don't need the soul to um, be uniform. The whole point of the soul is to be in individual expression. This is the whole identity politics thing. But we're talking about deriving some function from that, I think, some social function. Yeah, so Jung defines the soul on the one hand as the relation to the unconscious, the relation to the unconscious, and on the other hand as a personification of unconscious content. So again, it's soul as psychopomp, guide, or bridge to the unconscious. Obviously, a more kind of civilized point of view might not like this, but then Jung says, since analytical psychology is concerned with man as he is and not with man as he would like to be, we have to admit that those same phenomena which impel the primitive to speak of souls still go on happening. We may believe as much as we please in the doctrine of the unity of the ego, according to which there can be no such things as autonomous complexes, but nature herself does not bother in the least about our abstract theories. And then Jung makes the next move, which is to say, according to our previous definition, God too is an unconscious content, a personification, insofar as he's thought of as personal, and as an image or expression of something, insofar as he's thought of as dynamic. And so, from Jung's point of view here, God and the soul are essentially the same when regarded as personifications. He therefore defines Meister Eckhart's view as psychological. And that was what we meant by there's a blissfulness of God being in the soul that Jung can understand as a state of intense vitality. This is again by drawing analogy from the Eastern analogies that we were exploring, where that's a kind of it's a state of being that does not exist so long as God is projected upon objects. It only exists when God is taken within, and particularly within the soul. In that high state, God himself becomes blissful. Jung says, psychologically, this means that when the libido is invested in God, i.e., the surplus value that has been projected is recognized as a projection, the object then loses its overpowering significance, and the surplus value then consequently accrues to the individual, giving rise to a feeling of intense vitality and new potential. God, life at its most intense, then resides in the soul, in the unconscious. And I would understand this as a total integrity or alignment between that which is most personal or unique about one and that which is here we can see transpersonal or transcendent, and also by virtue of that, not belonging to one. So it's a fulfillment of one's individuality, uniqueness, but at the same time, it has a transpersonal aspect or quality that is also present. That's paradoxical and that doesn't bother us. Yeah, and that's what we mean by the function of the word ecstatic. Sorry, another phone. Okay, so I stopped for a while, so I'm just getting back into this, and we were talking about this kind of inner alignment that we see in Meister Eckhart between the God and the soul, where this leads to this state of inner bliss or intense vitality that we saw in Eckhart's quote from earlier, where the um, for so long as God, the highest value is not in the soul, it is somewhere outside. So in this case with Eckhart, God must be sort of withdrawn from objects, brought into the soul, and this is a kind of quite higher state in which God himself is blissful, being in the soul. And Jung said that psychologically this means that the libido invested in God, the surplus value that's been projected, is recognized as a projection and withdrawn within. So the object loses its significance, its overpowering quality, and the surplus value accrues to the individual. We already talked about that. We were talking about in this context the ecstatic function of symbols. This was from that short level, I think it was it 18, episode 18, the ecstatic function of symbols in relation to this is the way through symbols. And yeah, Jung sort of saying that here that there's something about withdrawing from the world, right? Like withdrawing from objects. But I think we can also see that it doesn't have to just be an introverted condition. It can also be that God is a kind of emergent function, emergent property, or a function of the relationship between soul and world. I think there's a way that world can be deified in a certain way that isn't idolatry, but is actually when through language, for example, when we speak to things so as to, I don't know, draw them into themselves. I don't know exactly how to language that. There's a way that God can emerge from that. Anyway, we moving on from that. I'm on page 248. Yeah, Jung's talking about how when we conceive God in this way as a kind of autonomous psychic complex, it's only partially conscious, associated with the ego only in a limited degree. So obviously, this is Jung wanting to get God into a position where it's kind of equivalent to his version of of his concept of the self, which we can speak about at length. It's not something that the ego can wholly comprehend, because otherwise it would no longer be autonomous. This is what allows him to say that the determining factor isn't the overvalued object anymore, but instead it becomes the unconscious. So yeah, so there's a kind of I think the way of relating to this is a feeling of inner alignment. It's a feeling that one can have when one, in the language of the Old Testament, that God works through one. And there's a kind of inner determination by which I mean a determining influence that where um there would be opposites on either side. So on one side, it would be that we're consciously led around sort of too much by our rational or egotistical, egoic qualities. We're sort of deciding in a somewhat arbitrary way based on the story that we tell about ourselves, and it's sort of being cut off from our inner depths, the inner depths of our being determined. But on the other hand, the risk would be possession and being overwhelmed by what is coming from deeply within where when we feel this again alignment between God and the soul, there's a feeling of integrity or integration. This is what I mean by alignment, um, where the determining influences are now felt as coming from within oneself, and this feeling produces a oneness of being, a relation between conscious and unconscious, in which, of course, the unconscious predominates. Yeah, so if I go briefly, for example, etymology of integrity. Comes from the Latin integer meaning whole or complete. From the Latin integritas, wholeness. Yeah, integer, intact. Those all get at aspects of what I mean. Entirety, integral. Integrity meaning soundness, wholeness, purity, blamelessness. Okay. Yeah, it's kind of seamless flow. Yeah, so Jung is then wanting to ask, where does that blissful feel like and we're talking about a feeling state or a condition, not just an emotion, that arises from an alignment between God and the soul, where God, or whatever is deified, is felt as flowing from deeply within. And there's a kind of blissful state of intense vitality that we saw analogized in these Eastern conceptions of Brahman. And Jung is now wanting to ask, where does that, he said, whence comes this blissful feeling? So it's reminiscent of the child because of the influence from the unconscious. So Jung says, in this Brahman-like state of Ananda, with the supreme value lying in the unconscious, there is a drop in the conscious potential. The unconscious becomes the determining factor, and the ego almost entirely disappears. And this is why, for Jung, it's reminiscent of a childlike state. And so Jung sees it. This is kind of what we mean by reconvening at the source. Like it's access to it's God experienced as an inner source, an inner fountain, but which is also in a kind of original condition associated with a childlike state that goes along with the qualities of childlikeness, including, for example, not just blissfulness, but uh, a kind of ease. I would say it has to do with flow, as in the flow state, but also spontaneity, a kind of natural creativity, or blissful innocence. I would also mention the sort of um, provocative, impish, or duplicitous qualities of the child. It has a double nature. The myth of the divine child, the symbol. Yeah, Jung says the feeling of bliss accompanies all those moments when one feels borne along by the current of life, when what was dammed up can flow off without restraint, when there is no need to do this thing or that thing with a conscious effort in order to find a way out or to achieve a result. We've all known situations or moods when things go of themselves, when we no longer need to manufacture all sorts of wearisome conditions for our joy or pleasure. The time of childhood is the unforgettable emblem of this joy, which, unperturbed by things without, pours in a warm flood from within. Yeah, so for me, this is obviously connecting with the myth of the rebirth of God in terms of the story of Pandora. So it's a change in the quality that is deified rather than a sort of overbearing and wearisome Skyfather um, having qualities of like justice and heaviness. It's more about a kind of childlikeness that comes with a joyful and a pleasurable, easy quality. Yeah, where in this context, to be like a child means to possess a treasury of accumulated libido which can constantly stream forth. And it's forth into the world. And this is my whole point. It's not just withdrawal from the world, it's a flowing out into the world. The libido of the child flows into things. In this way, he gains the world. Yeah, and that by degrees we then lose ourselves in the world by overvaluing things, and then that sort of for Jung entails the necessity of sacrifice, the withdrawal of libido and severance of ties. And where by what he means is this by being in this childlike condition, we lose ourselves in the world. Again, it's sort of going down into nominalism, by which where the teachings of religion then seek to gather energy together again, which is sort of towards a realist point of view, philosophically, obviously. Yeah, and so we're just talking about the flow of energy in Jungian terms from introverted to extroverted conditions. And Jung talks about this in terms of harmony with nature, the following of instinct without difficulty. The Chinese Wu Wei is obviously relevant. Yeah, where religious practice enables us to create the magical power that we need, whether on the one hand, religious practice going, again, this is directly in terms of the ecology of practices, of helping eros to be properly proportioned out and among the relevant objects, but then also effectively withdrawn and gathered and recohered into unity. Yeah, again, Jung is more oriented to the latter of those two conditions, where I think it's like in this childlike state that things naturally flow out and into the world. Whereas the religions, he says, the aim of the great religions is expressed in the injunction not of this world and implies the inward movement of libido into the unconscious. Its withdrawal and introversion create in the unconscious a concentration of libido, which is symbolized as the treasure. We spoke about this at length in relation to Pandora and the jewel. This is the pearl of great price, the philosopher's stone, the treasure in the field. It's also the grail. Yeah, Eckhart interprets this. It's again, this is the it's God as the jewel. So there's a concentration of energy in the introverted condition that is withdrawn inside, and a symbol of that concentration of energy is the treasure, the jewel. And Jung interprets that as, quote, Christ says, the kingdom of heaven is like a treasure hid in a field. This field is the soul, wherein lies hidden the treasure of the divine kingdom. In the soul, therefore, are God and all creatures blessed. So Jung says that sort of corroborates his argument that the soul is a personification of the unconscious, and that's where this treasure lies, that libido, which is immersed in introversion and allegorized as God's kingdom, which amounts to, according to Jung, a sort of union with God, living in his kingdom. Yeah, so the idea is that obviously that libido used to be energy, uh, is used to be invested in objects, but is then withdrawn into the unconscious. Um, when it was within objects, it made the world seem all powerful, and God was then outside. But now he works from within as the hidden treasure conceived as God's kingdom. Jung says, if then Eckhart reaches the conclusion that the soul is itself God's kingdom, it's conceived as a function of relation to God. And God would be the power working within the soul and perceived by it. Eckhart even calls the soul the image of God. Yeah, and so this is how Jung sort of arrives at his conception. This is why he's drawing from Eckhart so much, because it really aligns with his own experiences from the Red Book. The soul is in an intermediate position. It's a function of relation between the ego and God, between the subject and the inaccessible depths of the unconscious. And so the determining force of God operating from those depths is reflected by the soul. This is page 251. It creates images and symbols, and the soul is itself only an image. It is both receiver and transmitter, an organ for perceiving unconscious contents, and what it perceives are symbols. But the thing about symbols, and this is why they're so important here, again, we're trying to answer this question, how can we take up the perspective of the soul in a way that avoids the trap of relativism, in a way that avoids the Protestant fragmentation into a multiplicity of different churches? Well, the thing about symbols, symbols are shaped energies, determining ideas whose affective power is just as great as their spiritual value. And so the idea is that the organization inheres within the symbols themselves. Again, it's a recovery of the symbolic core of humanity, I would say, as in the sense of man and his symbols, without um, reducing those symbols to any particular story. The idea is to take perspectives on different stories while at the same time preserving narrative order and narrative identity, but being able to take perspectives on different stories while at the same time gaining access to the participatory experience, which is attendant upon participation in symbols, which come from a deeper level of our being. So the order that we're seeking inheres within the symbols and derived from those symbols. It doesn't derive from a top-down institutional dogma. So this state, we're talking about a particular state in which God is in the soul, in which the soul becomes a vessel for the unconscious, a vessel for God, and the soul makes itself an image or symbol of that unconscious. That's a happy condition, a blissful or intense a feeling of intense vitality. We see that in Eckhart's quote. If any should ask me, wherefore do we pray? Wherefore do we fast? Wherefore do we do all manner of good works? Wherefore are we baptized? Wherefore did God become man? I would answer, so that God may be born in the soul, and the soul again in God. Therefore were the Holy Scriptures written. Therefore did God create the whole world, that God might be born in the soul, and the soul again in God. The innermost nature of all grain is wheat, and of all metal gold, and of all birth man. According to Jung, here Eckhart states bluntly that God is dependent on the soul, and at the same time that the soul is the birthplace of God. The soul is the birthplace of God. Can we see from here how clearly this applies to the function of an ecology of practices? That if we can, in togetherness, take up the perspectives of the soul and give rise to, uh, occasions of communion, states of group flow, and indeed co-created works that take form, I think we're in a position to appreciate how functional that can be, how meaningful that can be, how cohering that can be. And that gives us this combination that we're looking for because it's out of the creativity, it's out of the uniqueness, it's out of the personality of the soul that we can give rise to that. Jung, the organ of perception, the soul, apprehends the contents of the unconscious, and as the creative function, gives birth to its dynamis in the form of a symbol. Jung then talks about different ways of making use of such symbols. And again, this should be pretty obvious why they're useful from here, but there are artistic possibilities, philosophical possibilities, quasi-religious possibilities, and the fourth the fourth way of employing the dynamics of these images is to squander it in every form of licentiousness. Yeah, we then don't want to devolve into the um, different forms of Gnosticism labeled by Jung ascetic and anarchic. We don't like, I'm talking, yes, it's, I mean, it kind of goes off into cult formation there, but I think we can see how this is an evolution that can fit into a genuine spiritual hierarchy. Like I'm not talking, like I'm talking about something which is totally compatible with um, tradition. Because I think the problem here is that everyone needs dogma. You know, everyone needs a story. And we can't be constantly transcending that story. We have to also ground ourselves in a particular story. But there's also this important capacity to get beyond stories, to take perspectives on them. And everyone also needs a certain particularity in their symbols, but there's also a universality to them. I think the best place would be to reserve this part of the discussion for Gary Clark, Carl Jung, and the evolutionary sciences, where we sort of talk about the trends that have to do with exogamy and endogamy in the context of um, Indigenous Australian intra and intertribal relations, where there's this balance of energy going toward coherence within groups, but then out toward coherence among groups. And there's different distributions of energy and different types of relations that serve for each. I won't go on about that here. But I'm wanting to avoid the cult thing by saying it's not that every group can just have its own symbols. There has to be some kind of, yeah, intertribal, intergroup networking. But I think we can see that in terms of the philosophical Silk Road and in terms of the digital campfires. There's a way that different local communities are cohering into a global network. Again, if we use the analogy of the tent, well, it's we don't want to always be pushing toward the top of the pyramid. I mean, yes, not of this world is the whole point of religion, but the only way we can ever get close to the top of the pyramid is if we also build the bottom. And it's not that the top is more valuable than the bottom in a sense, even though in a sense it is. Anyway, just orienting myself. Yeah, so what Jung is then talking about next is like the whole point of the symbols is that they result in a better adaptation to reality. And that's why it's so important that the extroverted side of the personality, which has a more um, collective quality, it's more adapted to what is already. And so it's easy to misrecognize the value of the new and like the symbolic and creative products. The whole point of them is that they allow better adaptation to reality. Um, while at the same time promoting the subject's happiness and well-being, which is, according to Jung, their main value. Anyway, then Jung talks about like what to do with them, which he talks about in terms of the treatment, how to treat these symbols. And he talks about a synthetic method um, that sort of elaborates these symbolic fantasies resulting from the introversion of libido through sacrifice that produces a new attitude to the world. The difference from the manner of collective adaptation is that which produces a new potential. And it's that transition to a new kind of attitude to the world that he terms the transcendent function. It's a quality of regeneration or renewal or rebirth. So it results in some form of positive achievement. It's equivalent to a renewal of life that Eckhart symbolizes through by God's birth. Eckhart speaks of God's birth as a continual process. I think I would, it's again the quality of eternal return. It's a seasonal or cyclical event, very much going on now. Yeah, Jung invokes Goethe's idea of systole and diastole. It has a rhythmic quality. Um, yeah, it has a repetitive process. Again, the transcendent function is like going out into the world and applying oneself, encountering a problem, then withdrawing the energy, taking it deeply within, allowing for the emergence of a symbol that results in a new attitude that sort of dissolves the previous blockage. And so we can take that into group practice by like if we like adopting certain identities where that can go along with a certain story that results in certain characters being visible where there are certain perspectives that can't be taken. And if we can work with those different perspectives and sort of, I think the way would be to allow that story to exist out in the world, allow us to recognize that we can't move forward in that story, and then to withdraw energy, to take energy within in some way, to allow the unconscious to produce a certain symbolic or creative solution that can then be applied. We're starting to get some outlines on what I'm talking about. It's a kind of rhythmic quality. I'm talking about applying the transcendent function in group process to resolve the split between different polarities, different dualities. Yeah, again, Jung's making the point here that like uh, propositional like explication, philosophizing doesn't get us further along in explaining symbols. There's something um, irremovably irrational and non-propositional about symbols, and we don't get to explain that away. And the thing is that that's not something to be lamented. It's something to be. It's an important. There's something that symbols get us access to that we can't get by any other means. It allows they allow us to participate in non-propositional ways of knowing. To quote Eckhart, by being created, the soul created God, for he did not exist until the soul was made. A little while since, and I declared, I am the cause that God is God. God is gotten of the soul. His Godhead he has of himself. Hmm. So again, what we're moving towards is a deep convergence between individuality, uniqueness, personality, who we are in the depths of our being. That involve, I mean, this is also, by the way, validating or corroborating episode 20. Eckhart says, therefore, do I turn back once more to myself. Therefore, do I find the deepest places, deeper than hell itself. For even from there does my wretchedness drive me. Nowhere can I escape myself. Here I will set me down, and here I will remain. We're also avoiding inflation here. We're talking about the capacity to, by inhabiting the perspective of the soul, to allow God to flow through one in a way that can be like natural and easy, where we don't have to burn each other at the stake for saying that. We could talk about this in terms of Christ consciousness, or doesn't have to be that though. Because again, I was sort of referring to, or at least alluding to, limitations on the perspective of Christ, but not that we want to reduce it either. Yeah, where one can inhabit the state of godlikeness without being inflated by it. We talked about that in terms of the story of Prometheus and Pandora, where it was Prometheus' quality of being able to take up his own inner divinity that allowed him to relate to the soul on equal terms. So this is actually internally, if we're going to talk about being realistic about um, engaging with the soul or the divine double as a perspective that one can take up, one needs a certain quality of ego strength to facilitate that. That is drawn from the. It's very paradoxical. The God comes through the soul gives birth to God, but it's also one's inner alignment or integrity or, yeah, alignment is best with God, and the feeling of that childlike feeling of flow, of spontaneity and creativity. There's a kind of strength um, that is very much not inflation, but does have a divine quality, and it's that quality that allows one to take up the perspective of the soul. Eckhart says, God comes into being and passes away. It's a deeply personal quality of the soul. Because all creatures declare him, God comes into being. While yet I abode in the ground and the depths of Godhead, in its flood and source. None asked me whither I went or what I did. None was there who could have questioned me. But when I flowed forth, all creatures declared God. And why did they not declare the Godhead? All that is in Godhead is one, and of that there is nothing to declare. Only God does. Godhead does nothing. There is nothing it can do, and never has it looked for anything to do. God and Godhead are as different as doing and non-doing. When I come home again in God, I do nothing more in myself. So this, my breaking through, is much more excellent than my first going out. For truly it is I who bring all creatures out of their own into my mind, and make them one in me. When I come back into the ground and the depths of Godhead, into its flood and source, none asks me whence I came or whither I went. None missed me. God passes away. So to draw on Jung, we see from these passages that Eckhart distinguishes between God and Godhead, where Godhead is all, neither knowing nor possessing itself, whereas God is a function of the soul, just as the soul is a function of Godhead. Complicated. So Godhead, we can understand as this all-pervading creative power, or in psychological terms, a kind of self-generating or creative instinct. It has an Ouroboros quality. It's a quality of perpetual motion or self-generating energy that neither knows nor possesses itself, comparable to Schopenhauer's universal will. Whereas it's sort of like there's an experience again that if one is in the state of unity with the groundless ground, the ground of being, the eye by which we see things. Jung is sort of regarding through Eckhart, God is sort of the manifest form, what we create in the condition of childlikeness, the actuality of the symbols, drawing those symbols out into the world. Whereas being in Godhead, um, there's a quality of no thingness or emptiness that is non-manifest, but that can be felt. But again, I want to be careful about that because it's not, we can feel it, but those feelings also point toward something which is beyond them. It's nothing, it's the non-dual state, what you could say. Again, it's like it's not a state either. So tricky to talk about. Yeah, that's it. So it's like God as manifest and actual, and Godhead as unmanifest and potential, let's say. But again, I just defined it. Jung says, um, God appears as issuing forth from Godhead and the soul. Like every creature, the soul declares him. He exists insofar as the soul distinguishes itself from the unconscious and perceives its dynamis. And he ceases to exist as soon as the soul is immersed in the flood and source of unconscious dynamis. Complicated anyway. Thus, Eckhart says, when I flowed out from God, all things declared, God is. Now, this cannot make me blessed, for thereby I acknowledge myself a creature. But in my breaking through, I stand empty in the will of God, and empty also of God's will, and of all his works, even of God himself. Then I'm more than all creatures. Then I'm neither God nor creature. But in my breaking through, I stand empty in the will of God. Then I am neither God nor creature. I am what I was, and that I shall remain now and evermore. Then I receive a thrust which carries me above all angels. By this thrust I become so rich that God cannot suffice me, despite all that he is as God and all his godly works. For in this breakthrough I receive what God and I have in common. I am what I was. I neither increase nor diminish, for I am the unmoved mover that moves all things. Here God can find no more place in man, for man, by his emptiness, has won back that which he eternally was and ever shall remain. To me, it speaks for itself. Meister Eckhart speaks for himself. don't look to me to try and help understand this. It's very clear to me what this means. I mean, I can draw straight from psychedelia here. It's a state of mystical experience that involves a condition of being and being with what is and recognizing God in what is. It's a state of complete acceptance that, but there's also totally ecstatic. I mean, it definitely has there's definitely an erotic flavor that one can detect. Shades of Freud. Anyway, it's by no means reducible to that. We're almost through the Eckhart stuff here. Again, two different conditions. One in which one is sort of in this inner state of inner unity, inner emptiness. And the eye by which I see God is the same eye by which God sees me. That which Nietzsche couldn't achieve in looking at the abyss, looking at the void. It's stepping in and swimming in it, becoming that void. And it's from that condition that one is able to enter into this state of childlike exuberance, blissfulness, vitality, energy, joyfulness, spontaneity, creativity, and innovation. And that is then, I mean, not only are symbols created from that, and one can use those symbols as a bridge either way to participate in that source that we were just discussing, and to then flow out into the world. And in that extroverted creating, flowing out, that means, according to Jung, page 255, a realization of the unconscious content and unconscious dynamics in the form of an idea born of the soul. It's an act of conscious differentiation from the unconscious, separation of the ego as subject from God, and by that act, God becomes. Sort of from being into becoming by doing. But it's a doing which is non-doing and doing which naturally arises without any effort, effortless effort. Yeah, numerous analogies with these ideas are immediately apparent, quite obviously. Yeah, Jung understands that in the absence of direct transmission, this parallelism proves that Eckhart was thinking from the depths of the collective psyche, which is common to East and West. This universal foundation, for which no common historical background can be made answerable, underlies the primitive mentality with its energic conception of God. Very, again, tortured language from Jung, but the idea is that there's a common creative source that all the stories derive from, and it's a symbolic source. It's both the source of symbols and that which symbols allow us to participate more deeply within. There's a university, it's a quality of both deepest particularity, uniqueness, but also universality that we find in that place. Yeah, Jung says, sort of toward the end here, the return to primeval nature and mystic regression to the psychic conditions of prehistory are common to all religions, in which the impelling dynamis has not yet petrified into an abstract idea, but is still a living experience, no matter whether this be expressed in ceremonies of identification with the totem among the Australian Aborigines or in the ecstasies of the Christian mystics. As a result of this retrograde process, the original state of identity with God is reestablished and a new potential is produced. However improbable such a state may be, however improbable such a state may be, it is a profoundly impressive experience. I can attest to that, which by revivifying the individual's relation to God as an object, creates the world anew. Yeah, and so this is the purpose, the function, the vitality of the relativity of the God symbol. And from there, Jung wants to mention, he says, we would be failing in our duty if we omitted to mention that solitary poet whose tragic fate it was to find no relation, either to his own times or to his own inner vision. Angelus Silesius, who is actually Johann Scheffler, mystic and doctor from 1624 to 1677. I quoted quite a lot of this in the comments on zombies in Western culture. This is in part four. Anyway, what Eckhart labored to express with a great effort of thought, and often in barely intelligible language, Angelus Silesius sings in touchingly intimate verses, which portray the relativity of God with naive simplicity. His verses speak for themselves, and I quote, I know that without me, God can no moment live. Were I to die, then he could no longer could survive. I know that without me, God can no moment live. Were I to die, then he no longer could survive. God cannot without me a single worm create. Did I not share with him, destruction were its fate. I am as great as God, and he is small like me. He cannot be above, nor I below him be. In me is God a fire, and I in him its glow. In common is our life, apart we cannot grow. In common is our life, apart we cannot grow. God loves me more than self. My love doth give his weight. Whatever he gives to me, I must reciprocate. He's God and man to me. To him I'm both indeed. His thirst I satisfy. He helps me in my need. This God who feels for us, this God who feels for us, is to us what we will, and woe to us if we our part do not fulfill. God is whatever he is. I am what I must be. If you know one, in sooth, you know both him and me. I am not outside God, nor leave I him afar. I am his grace and light, and he my guiding star. I am the vine which he doth plant and cherish most. The fruit which grows from me is God, the Holy Ghost. I am God's child, his son, and he too is my child. We are the two in one, both son and father mild. To illuminate my God, the sunshine I must be. My beams must radiate his calm and boundless sea. It's from Angelus Silesius. Apparently, the 12 stanzas do not constitute one continuous poem, but are respectively aphorisms. I won't pronounce the extremely German title anyway. So, yeah, these aren't just, for Jung, these aren't just sort of audacious ideas. It's a vibe that they're transmitting, you know. Jung invokes the collective unconscious to explain this. It's like they're expressing a certain current. Quote, below the threshold of consciousness, thousands of other nameless ones arranged behind them with similar thoughts and feelings, ready to open the gates of a new age. In these bold ideas, we hear the voice of the collective psyche, which with imperturbable assurance and the finality of a natural law brings about spiritual transformation and renewal. Obviously, we don't need to buy into the actual new age. Like I'm trying to trying to indicate that pretty. I'm doing as much as I can to steer away from nonsense. I mean, I've been referring to all along the way as many who I would consider experts, and I will continue to do that. But yeah, I guess the question would be how much time do these experts devote to dancing? I think that's a pretty good question to ask. But the thing is that this, yeah, again, this and to end this, we end up here in the Reformation, which did away with the church as the dispenser of salvation and established this personal relation to God. And the logical consequence of that subjectifying was this splitting up into sects. And that the extreme outcome of that is the individualism which we see in the modern condition, the relativity of the postmodern condition. And that results in the mini crisis. It results in this detachment from the world which we experience. And the danger that comes from that is resubmersion. This is the Nietzschean regression to the the earth, you know, to the state of mystical unity, which is very much not pleasant. It's a version of it that isn't. Which is why, like again, it's an ever like I yeah, I have a I'm a bit provocative, you know, like there's a sense of reformation and um not fitting in. Yeah, I've definitely side with the mystics rather than the priests, you know. But at the same time, there is an order here. I'm trying to indicate that. I think that the whole point is that that order is naturally derived, not artificially derived. Yeah, I mean, I might invoke part three of Jamie Wheal's Recapture the Rapture, which was entitled Ethical Cult Building. Um, there are there's a wealth of historical anthropological material that we can draw from to understand how to do this, to rebuild culture in a way that moves us beyond the one-sided stories, the inflexibility of the institutions, but that is a new form of order. I might invoke the Jordan Hall and John Vecchi, The Future of Governance series. Jung quotes, whenever this submersion in instinct occurs, it's compensated by a growing resistance to the chaos of sheer dynamism, by a need for form and order, structure. Diving down into the maelstrom, the soul must create a symbol that captures and expresses this dynamism. It is this process in the collective psyche that is felt or intuited by poets and artists whose main source of creativity is their perception of unconscious contents, and whose intellectual horizon is wide enough to discern the crucial problems of the age, or at least their outward aspects. I mean, I'm doing everything I can to show, not just tell, how this is in the sense of Christ as a reformer. He's someone who knew his tradition and who, let's say, incarnated a new aeon in a way that went beyond what had been achieved before. I mean, Buddha as also a reformer, um, Siddhartha. It's a move into understanding this in a hyperdimensional way and experiencing that in a hyperdimensional way that preserves a sense of continuity and through line, but that also responds. I mean, it's a phoenix, as I say, it's phoenix logic. And I don't think that works unless we recognize that God died. Because any story that we get stuck in becomes an inflexibility. There's a vitality and aliveness and yeah, the creativity that we need to leverage, and we can't do that from within the confines of any particular story, ultimately. But again, I've talked at length about narrative order, narrative identity, the whole point of purpose in the world. I'm not talking about giving up stories. I'm talking about being able to take them on and off like clothing, not wanting to get stuck in the story layer, but not only moving deeper within our own being, but allowing the depths of our own being and the depths of who we really are, each of us, to be not incidental, not secondary to our purpose, to the whole, that we can see and experience and feel and live a direct relationship between who we really are, who we feel that we really are, and who we really could be also, and what we're able to contribute in a way that does not result in anarchy or deconstructionism, or that doesn't have to, but that can be genuinely creative. And neither nostalgia nor utopia, that's what the man said on his gravestone, no less. So we have to get practical. And I've tried to show how I'm doing that procedurally. And again, where did it go? No, we don't want etymology of integrity. We want this one again. I'm talking about a way of life that, yes, it can be put into retreat form, but it's not. I'm just showing this here so that this can be paused. And yes, in retreat form, in workshop form, an ecology of practices. But yeah, it has to be in terms of creating community, and it's not just a retreat, it has to be a whole way of life. And I mean, I'm trying to show how, not just tell. Okay, I will come back to the nature of the uniting symbol in Spitler and finally be able to finish off psychological types with hopefully the rest of a review. But yeah, thanks to Meister Eckhart.